King Darien Voss had not smiled in 6 months. Not since the wedding. Not since the day he stood at the altar in his own great hall, wearing his finest coat and his most carefully constructed expression, and married a woman he did not love in front of every diplomat, lord, and council member in 3 territories. He was not cruel about it. That was the thing people never understood. He was perfectly kind to Mira. He spoke to her at dinner. He asked about her day. He made sure her rooms were warm and her staff was respectful. He did everything a good husband was supposed to do. He just did it the way a man performs a duty, correctly, completely, without a single piece of his heart involved. Mira Ashford knew it. She had known it from the beginning. She was not a foolish woman. She was the sister of a powerful alpha, and she had grown up watching men trade women like land deeds and call it diplomacy. She had walked into this marriage with her eyes open and her expectations low, and she had made her peace with it somewhere between the vows and the reception dinner. She did not hate Darien for it. She understood him, which was almost worse. The bond mark on Darien's left wrist had been warm the day of the wedding. It had been warm every day since. A faint, constant heat, like an ember that refused to go out, the biological remnant of a mate bond that the entire kingdom believed had died 3 years ago, along with the woman it connected him to. Celine Rourke. He did not say her name out loud anymore. He had stopped after the first year, when saying it had started to feel like pressing a bruise just to confirm it still hurt. It still hurt. The Eastern Summit convened every 18 months, drawing council members and territorial leaders from across the region into the palace for 3 days of negotiations, formal meals, and the kind of careful political conversation that exhausted everyone involved. Darien moved through it efficiently. He shook hands. He signed papers. He sat at the head of the long council table and listened to Cade Ashford, his brother-in-law, Mira's older brother, the man whose signature had made the treaty possible, speak about border agreements with the smooth, practiced confidence of someone who had never once doubted himself. Darien had never liked Cade. That had not changed when Cade became family. It was on the second afternoon of the summit, while Darien was crossing the main courtyard from the council chambers to his private office, that he stopped walking. He stopped because the bond mark on his wrist, which had been a dull and constant warmth for 3 years, suddenly became a fire. He looked down at it, then he looked up. She was standing at the far end of the courtyard, near the main gate, with a hood drawn around her face and a small child balanced on her left hip. The child was, perhaps 2 years old. He had dark hair and a calm, watchful expression that Darien recognized with the kind of certainty that bypasses thought entirely and goes straight to the body. Celine slowly pulled back her hood. 3 years. She was thinner than he remembered, and her eyes carried something new. Not pain exactly, but the particular steadiness of a person who has been through pain and arrived somewhere on the other side of it. She looked at him the way you look at something you have been rehearsing in your mind for a very long time. She did not smile. She did not run to him. She did not cry. She just stood there, in his courtyard, with his son on her hip, and held his gaze. Darien's court administrator was saying something to him. He could hear the words but not the meaning. The bond mark was burning. 3 years of a carefully maintained silence and discipline collapsed in the space between one heartbeat and the next, and he stood in the middle of his own courtyard, surrounded by his own people, completely unable to move. He was aware, distantly, that Cade Ashford had appeared at the corridor entrance behind him. He was aware that Cade had gone very still. They were given a private room, Celine and the child, whose name was Eli, within the hour. Not the dungeon, not the guest quarters assigned to minor visitors. The good rooms, the ones with tall windows. Because Darien could not find words for anything yet, but he could find rooms. He went to her alone that evening. Eli was asleep on the bed, one fist curled under his chin. Celine was sitting in the chair by the window, and she looked at Darien when he came in and said, "Sit down. There is a lot to tell you, and I need you to hear all of it before you say anything." He sat. She talked for a long time. The night before she disappeared, she had felt the mate bond fully complete between them, a certainty as real and total as anything she had ever experienced. She had gone home to collect her things, intending to come back to him in the morning and tell him everything. She never made it to morning. 2 of Kate Ashford's men had been waiting for her at her house. They had not hurt her, not physically. They had simply told her that she was leaving, that a transport was ready, that if she attempted to contact Darien or return to the Eastern Territory, the evidence they held of her family's involvement in a previous border violation would be presented to the king, and her family would lose everything. She had gone. Not because she was weak, because her younger brother had been 17 years old, and the evidence was real, and she had made the decision that a mother, even one who did not yet know she was one, makes. She had sacrificed herself to protect someone smaller. She had spent 3 years in the Northern Outpost territories. She had worked. She had had the baby alone. She had built something small and quiet and survivable out of the pieces available to her. And then, 8 months ago, a contact she had developed, a woman who moved correspondence between territories for traders, had passed her a packet of documents. Kate Ashford's own letters. His instructions to his men the night she was taken, his communications with a palace advisor, orchestrating the story of her death, his timeline for introducing Mira into Darien's life once enough grief had accumulated. The treaty marriage had not been an accident of politics. It had been constructed, planned. Kate had wanted access to the Eastern Territories for years, and a bereaved, isolated king was far easier to negotiate with than a bonded one. Celine placed the documents on the table between them. Darien looked at them for a long moment. Then he looked at his son asleep on the bed. Then he looked at the bond mark on his wrist, which had not cooled. He did not say anything for a very long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet and completely controlled, which was the most dangerous version of Darien Voss that anyone who knew him had ever encountered. He said, "Where is the original correspondence?" Celine opened her coat and took out a sealed envelope. "Everything is in here." Mira Ashford found out before the Summit Council did. Not because Darien told her. He had intended to in the morning, carefully, with the appropriate gravity, but because Mira was observant, and she had watched her brother's face in the courtyard that afternoon when the woman with the child appeared at the gate. She had seen Cade go still. She had recognized the specific quality of that stillness. She went to her brother's rooms that night and knocked on the door, and when he opened it, she looked at him and said, "Tell me what you did." Cade was a man who had built his entire career on the management of information. He knew which version of the truth to deploy and when, but Mira had known him since he was a boy, and she watched his face try to assemble itself into something plausible and fail, and she said, do not do that. Tell me the truth." He told her. Not everything, but enough. He framed it as strategy, as necessity, as something he had done for the family and the territory and the future. He used the kinds of words powerful men use when they explain to the people they have harmed that the harm was, in fact, love. Mira stood in the doorway and listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Where are the originals? The documents from the palace advisor?" Cade said, "Locked in my traveling case." "Why?" Mira said, "Because if they are found in your rooms during a summit that takes place in the king's palace, you will be arrested tonight rather than tomorrow morning, and I would prefer you to have until morning." Cade stared at her. "You're protecting me." "I am not protecting you," she said. "I am giving you until dawn to decide whether you would like to leave voluntarily or be removed. There is a difference." She paused. "And I am going to speak to the king." She went to Darien's study at midnight. He received her. He looked at her with the complicated expression of a man who did not know how to apologize for something that was not entirely his fault, but had still cost her something real. Mira sat down across from him and said, "I did not know." "I believe you," he said. "I want that stated clearly, for whatever process comes next. It will be." She looked at the bond mark on his wrist. It was visible from across the room, brighter than she had ever seen it, faintly luminous in the low light, the way a wound looks when it has finally been cleaned. She said, "She is good?" Darien said, "She is very good." Mira nodded. "The boy looks like you." "Yes." She stood up and smoothed her dress. There was nothing theatrical about it, no performance of sacrifice or suffering. She simply said, "I will cooperate with whatever the council requires. I would like, when this is over, to be given the governance of the Westfield province. My own territory, my own name. Darian looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Done." Mira walked to the door, stopped, and said without turning around, "She waited 3 years and came back with evidence instead of grief. You should know what that means about who she is." Then she left. The council met at dawn. Celine presented the documents herself. She stood at the long table in the council chamber, with the morning light coming in through the tall windows, and she spoke clearly and without drama. She had the voice of someone who had spent 3 years making herself heard in rooms that did not want to hear her, and she used it. She laid out Cade Ashford's correspondence piece by piece, the original instructions to his men, the timeline of her removal, the letters to the palace advisor who had confirmed her death to the king, the financial records showing Cade's investment in the treaty outcome. The council chamber was completely silent by the time she finished. Cade had been present. He had attempted, in the early minutes, to introduce the idea that the documents were fabricated. 3 council members had been willing to consider the possibility until Darian's chief records officer confirmed the handwriting, the seal, and the paper stock against 6 years of verified Ashford correspondence in the palace archive. After that, no one in the room looked at Cade. He was stripped of his territorial standing before the session ended. The treaty was formally dissolved. 2 council members who had known about elements of the arrangement and said nothing were placed on administrative suspension pending review. Cade Ashford left the Eastern Territory the following morning under escort. He did not speak to his sister before he left. He attempted, briefly, to speak to Darian. Darian looked at him for exactly 3 seconds, then turned and walked away. That was the last anyone heard from Cade Ashford for a very long time. 3 weeks later, the palace was quieter. The summit delegates had returned to their own territories. The administrative chaos of the dissolved treaty had been parceled out to the appropriate offices and was being managed, piece by people who were good at managing pieces. Mira Ashford had left for Westfield with a small staff and a document signed by Darian granting her full provincial authority. She had said goodbye to Celine in the main hallway, a brief, dignified, genuinely warm exchange between 2 women who had been placed in an impossible situation by the same man and had both survived it with their dignity intact. Mira had looked at Eli for a long moment before she left. Then she had put her hand briefly on Celine's arm and said, "Good luck with him. He is worth it, but he is also very difficult." Celine had smiled for the first time since returning. "I know." On a Sunday morning, when the palace was slow and the light was good, Darian found Celine and Eli in the south courtyard. Eli had recently discovered that stones could be thrown into the fountain, and he was doing this with complete dedication and the systematic focus of someone conducting an important scientific experiment. Celine was sitting on the bench beside the fountain, watching him with her elbow on her knee and her chin in her hand. Darian sat down next to her. They did not speak for a moment. Eli located a particularly excellent stone and launched it at the fountain with great satisfaction. Darian said, "I am sorry it took me 3 years to find you." Celine said, "You didn't know to look." "I should have." She turned and looked at him. There was no performance in her expression, no effort to make it easier for him, but no effort to make it harder either. Just honest assessment, the kind that only comes from someone who has thought about a thing for a very long time. "You have our son," she said. "You have the truth. You have time." She paused. "That is more than most people get." Eli had found a stick and was now using it to measure the depth of the fountain. This was clearly an advancement on the stone research. Darian watched his son for a moment. The bond mark on his wrist was warm, not burning, not aching, just warm, the way a hand feels when another hand holds it. He said, "What do you need? Right now. Not tomorrow. Today." Celine thought about it. "Eli needs a proper bath. He has been throwing rocks into fountains since 6 this morning." She paused. "And I would like coffee." Darian said, "I can do both of those things." "I know," she said. She did not move yet. Neither did he. They sat in the Sunday morning light in the south courtyard, and the fountain made its quiet sound, and Eli made his discoveries, and nothing was resolved in the way that stories usually resolve, with declarations and certainties and clean conclusions. But something had begun. That was enough. For now, that was exactly enough.